alive. One of my biggest mistakes with Kiss was a failure to pay attention to details. That was my nature back then, still is, to a degree. I wasn't that interested in the business side of the business, I was into the creative and fun side, which proved to be problematic. Problematic when things stopped being fun. In the early days I used to say to myself, you have the greatest job in the world. You get to do what you love to do, and you're getting paid to do it. Then one day I woke up, looked in the mirror, bleary-eyed and hungover, and thought, man, I'm not digging this at all. Maybe if I'd been a bit more attentive and clear-eyed as we rolled through those first few years, and gotten more positive feedback from everyone on my accomplishments, I'd have been in a position to offer more input and possibly help create a scenario in which I wouldn't have felt compelled to leave. Hindsight, man. It's a bummer. A waste of time, too. So much shit went down behind the scenes during the first few tours and during the recording of our first 3 albums. It's almost a miracle the band survived at all. We were working our asses off, touring like crazy, refining our live show, writing material, and cranking out record after record, maintaining a pace that today would be unimaginable. We weren't just burning the candle at both ends, we were incinerating the fucking thing. I'm sure Gene, Peter, and Paul were somewhat aware of the challenges we were facing at that time, but I was basically clueless. When I heard that Neil Bogart wanted us to get back in the studio just a few months after we released Hotter Than Hell, I was surprised. I knew enough about the record industry to know that it made little sense for us to make a third record so quickly. Unless, of course, things were going very well, or very badly. Even weirder was the news that Neil planned to produce our next album himself. Hey, I liked Neil a lot. We used to hang out a bit and party, and I still believe he was one of the most creative people the music industry has ever known. Kiss can never repay him for what he did and for the gambles he took on our behalf. Let's be honest, though, Neil was not a hard rock producer. He was a record company executive whose creative instincts about our music were not as reliable as his marketing savvy. My first choice for producer, as always, would have been Eddie Kramer. My second choice would have been to stick with Kenny Kerner and Richie Wise. But Casablanca was Neil's baby, he got to call the shots. And he wanted to sit at the control board. I didn't understand Neil's motivation, and frankly I didn't care. But I didn't think it made any sense, and neither did anyone else. After the Kiss in Time debacle, we were skeptical when it came to Neil's artistic input. Paul seemed the most bothered by the idea. What I didn't fully understand at the time was that Neil was fighting for his career, and for Kiss's career as well. Our first couple of albums had sold reasonably well, 75,000 copies for Kiss and about 100,000 for Hotter Than Hell. Not bad considering we weren't getting much radio airplay and hadn't produced anything close to a hit single. Apparently, though, we still weren't making any money for Casablanca and, more importantly, for our distributor, Warner Brothers. Our promotional and touring budget in those days was significantly higher than could be justified by our record sales. It didn't feel to me like we were living extravagantly. Our salary was still less than $100 per week, and we continued to book rooms at the lesser hotel chains, doubling up at every stop. Fast food and cheap beer got us through the days and nights. Sure, it was mostly fun, but believe me, it wasn't glamorous. What I considered frugality, though, Warner Brothers considered wasteful. When Warner declined to give Hotter Than Hell the promotional push Neil felt it deserved, he basically said to them, "Go fuck yourselves." Then he told us to get back in the studio. As was the case with the first 2 albums, Dressed to Kill was assembled quickly. Even though we had to write much of the material while we were recording, and even though Neil wasn't the ideal producer, the whole process was more enjoyable than it had been on Hotter Than Hell. Knowing that we had hated our time in L.A., Neil agreed to Come to New York and record the album at Electric Lady Studios. So we were home, which greatly improved our mood. One thing I didn't understand was why, during the recording process, Neil would smoke pot almost constantly without any objections from Gene or Paul, who were so anti-drug. They just looked the other way. Go figure. There was other crap going on, too. Neil had begun dating Joyce Biotz, which obviously left Joyce looking like she had a conflict of interest. She and Bill Aucoin were our co-managers, and while managers and record company executives often enjoy cordial relationships, they're not supposed to be having sex with each other. They do, of course. Happens all the time. But it looks very bad and makes everyone uncomfortable. Bill and Joyce were supposed to be looking out for the best interests of their clients, the biggest of which was Kiss. And sometimes what Kiss wanted was not exactly what Casablanca wanted. That's just the way it works. Talent managers and record company executives are supposed to spar once in a while. And they make strange bedfellows, to say the least. Joyce is a terrific gal and a good manager, but when she started dating Neil, it put everyone in a difficult position. Ultimately, Neil and Joyce married, and Bill became sole manager of Kiss, which was the only practical solution. I missed her for some time after that, since she always had a kind word to interject just at the right time and always encouraged me to do my best. Hanging over all of this was the nagging sense that maybe Casablanca wasn't the right place for us. Primarily out of loyalty to Neil, we'd turned down offers from other labels that wanted to buy out our contract. But the stakes were getting high. We all needed a breakthrough. Dressed to Kill, wasn't it? It's a good album, I think, though not nearly as strong as either of the first two records. Having Neil in the studio with us was kind of a trip, like having your boss looking over your shoulder while you work, but it became obvious fairly early in the process that while Neil had a lot of opinions about how the band should sound, and what types of songs we should record, he lacked the expertise to bring those ideas to life. Paul and Neil butted heads most of all. As a result, many of the technical and creative decisions on Dressed to Kill were made by the band members, along with Dave Whitman, the engineer, and we were listed as co-producers with Neil. Two things really distinguished Dressed to Kill. The first was the clever album cover, which featured the four of us standing on the corner of 8th Avenue and 23rd Street, wearing suits and ties and full makeup. We'd done something similar for a Cream photo shoot and liked the concept so much that we went with it for the album. Here we are, world, just regular guys going to work. The second was a song called Rock and Roll All Night, written by Gene and Paul with the specific intention of creating a Kiss anthem, something fans would wait all night to hear when they went to a live show, and then stand and scream their lungs out to when it was finally played. An anthem is a signature song, the ultimate sing-along. Neil felt like Kiss needed something like that and basically instructed Gene and Paul to come up with one. It's an backwards approach to the craft of songwriter, of course. Songs become popular for all kinds of reasons, but the most obvious one is because they're good. You try to write well and perform with honesty, and then you hope your fans respond. There's something very cynical about the idea of creating something designed specifically to provoke a certain reaction. But that was the way Neil worked, and in this case he was absolutely right. The first time we rehearsed Rock and Roll All Night in the studio, I knew it was a good song. When we actually laid down the track, I had a feeling it would be something special. To simulate the effect of thousands of concertgoers chanting along with the chorus, we invited our friends into the studio. It was while Neil and Joyce were there, leaning into a microphone. Bill Aucoin, Peter's wife, Lydia, and other people on our team all shouting along with the guys in the band, "I wanna rock and roll all night. And party every day." I think we all knew we had something unique with that song, and in fact it did do fairly well as a single. But it wasn't until we started playing Rock and Roll All Night live, with a blistering guitar solo thrown in for good measure, that it really became the anthem we had hoped for. Fans loved it, and it quickly became one of our signature songs and a reliable show-stopping encore for live performances. Unfortunately, we often weren't given an opportunity to do an encore. As our popularity increased and word of our live shows spread, an interesting thing began to happen. You see, we were still almost exclusively an opening act through our first 2 tours, but as time went on we began to notice that a growing percentage of the crowd represented Kiss fans. It's a tricky thing when you go out on the road as a supporting act. You want to put on a great show, you also want to get the audience all pumped up for the headliner. Those 2 goals aren't necessarily complementary. If you suck, the crowd will get pissed and boo you off the stage. If you're too good, though, the headliner will get pissed and fire you from the tour, or at least refuse to hire you again. In the beginning a lot of people simply didn't know what to make of Kiss. And we won them over anyway. As time went on we found that even though we were the opening act, the audience would sing along to our songs and sometimes get so worked up that they'd want an encore. We always delivered unless the headliner forbade it, which happened on more than one occasion. It's understandable, really. I mean, Kiss was a tough act to follow. Dressed to Kill was released on March 19, 1975, by the time it hit stores Kiss had become a live phenomenon. We weren't just a fringe band or a gimmick anymore. We were a band everyone wanted to see, a traveling circus that earned new fans with every stop along the way. 2 days after the record was released we played the Beacon Theater in New York. This was among the highlights of my time in Kiss. More so than the other guys, I'd grown up in the New York club scene. The Beacon was a New York landmark, a former movie theater that had recently been converted into a concert hall. In the coming years it would be one of the most popular live music venues in the city. And Kiss was at the forefront. The very first time we played there, we also were the headlining act. What a trip, man. Just a few weeks earlier we'd been in California, opening up for a band called JoJo Gunn. By the time we got to New York, the roles had been reversed, and JoJo Gunn was opening for Kiss. We sold out the Beacon. In fact, we sold out so quickly that a second show was added. More than 6,000 tickets were sold, an incredible number for a band that still had not yet had a hit single or album. I remember feeling an incredible rush of pride and adrenaline when we took the stage at the Beacon, with the crowd outside chanting our name. This was what we had been working so hard to achieve, and the satisfaction was immeasurable. I had a ton of friends in the audience that night. Jeanette was there. So were my parents. I remember the look on my mother's face when I saw her after the show. It was almost as though she couldn't imagine that her son was the same person she'd been watching. It was a mixture of pride and disbelief. Same thing with my father. Dad didn't say much, but I could tell he was proud. Or maybe just relieved that I hadn't turned out to be the complete fuck-up he suspected I'd be. I'm not one to worry about what journalists have to say about my music. Critics can be a snotty and self-important bunch of assholes. I discovered early in Kiss that they're completely out of touch with the general public. We made music for the masses, it was popular entertainment, and we were damn good at it. The very things fans loved. About Kiss, the simplicity, volume, energy, and especially the theatricality were the things that made so many journalists hate us. And the more highfalutin the publication, the more likely they were to take a crap on our records and performances. So imagine our surprise the morning after we appeared at the Beacon Theater, when a review published in the New York Times was not only fair, but downright flattering. The whole audience was standing on the seats for the last 45 minutes, an event even in these days of rock emotionalism. It may be overly simple and unpretentious rock, not so much sung as shouted, but Kiss communicates a sense of fun and commitment to the music. Yeah, I could live with that. The months that followed the release of Dressed to Kill were in some ways among the weirdest of my time in Kiss. Not in terms of bad behavior or disputes within the band or anything like that, but simply because we found ourselves treading water, commercially speaking. It made no sense. Here we were, playing bigger venues and drawing bigger crowds. Fans were starting to show up in Kiss costumes and makeup. They sang along throughout the show. We had moved something like 200,000 copies of Dress to Kill, again, without the benefit of a top 10 single. Our live show was so popular that suddenly we were viewed as a threat to many of the bands we had once supported. At the same time, we kept hearing horror stories from management about our dire financial situation. After splitting with Warner Brothers, Casablanca was in big trouble. Neil was financing projects out of his own pocket. Kiss was selling a decent number of records, but apparently still not enough to cover the cost of touring. I kept wondering where the money was, only to be told by Bill Aucoin that everything was a bit of a mystery, since Casablanca had been withholding our royalty statements. Bill began running up his credit cards to help keep the band afloat. I tried to ignore most of this and stay focused on the things I found important, playing and performing. But I couldn't help but wonder what we had to do in order to make Kiss a financial success. How could we tap into the enthusiasm, which was rapidly becoming fanaticism, that we saw every night from the stage? The answer, in retrospect, seems obvious: do a live album. But you have to remember that in 1975 live albums weren't exactly cash cows. A number of bands had tried and failed, so record labels were understandably reluctant to support them. Live albums generally were reserved for supergroups, bands with fan bases so large that you could expect to sell at least a moderate number of albums and therefore not lose money. The prevailing wisdom within the record industry at this time was that live albums were basically a waste of time and effort, especially if the band in question hadn't already accumulated a bunch of hit singles. Live albums for the most part were really nothing more than greatest hits packages rearranged and served warm to a ready audience. Kiss had no hit singles, no gold records. Why in the hell would anyone want to buy a live Kiss album? More importantly, why would any record label support the idea? For some reason, though, we thought we could buck the trend. I don't remember who came up with the idea, and I don't think anyone has ever taken credit for it. Everyone involved with Kiss understood that we were primarily a live band, a 2-hour thrill ride for concert goers. Our first 3 records were all solid, but none of them had captured the Kiss experience. Maybe the only way to do that was to put out a live album. The idea was kicked around for months. One night somebody pulled out a copy of Uriah Heep Live, a 2-record set released in 1973, and that gave us some ideas about concept and packaging. The idea simmered for a while, until Bill got involved and took it to Neil. For the longest time I couldn't believe that Casablanca gave a green light to the project, but I now realize it was basically a decision born of desperation. Part of Bill's argument centered on the fact that a live album would be cheaper to produce than a 4th studio album. Even if it failed, there would be less of an investment to recoup. Neil was already floundering. I guess he just figured, what have we got to lose? When I heard that Casablanca had opted to go forward with the live project, I was intrigued, and when they told me Eddie Kramer would be in charge, I got really excited. We hadn't worked with Eddie since the demo days, and we all had a ton of respect for him. Even with 3 albums on our resume, I knew we'd yet to record anything that sounded as strong as the demo we'd put together with Eddie. The guy was a fucking genius. If anyone could do justice to Kiss, if anyone could produce a live album by a road-weary theatrical hard rock band and turn it into something unique, it was Eddie. I knew in my gut that he was the right man for the job. There were a number of different approaches you could take when assembling a live record. The simplest, and probably most cost-effective, was to set up equipment at a single show and try to capture the songs and experience of one night on the road. Eddie had different ideas. Since it's almost impossible to be perfect on any given night, he decided to record 5 different concerts and cull the best material. When Alive was released in September 1975, hardly anyone knew that this was the strategy we'd employed. Most people presumed the album was an exact re-creation of a single Kiss concert performed on May 16, at Cobo Hall in Detroit. This was not the case at all. The recording and remixing of Alive has been the subject of endless speculation and gossip over the years, so I'll try to set the record straight here. Eddie came out on the road with us and made it clear from the start that he would do whatever he had to do in order to capture the Kiss experience on vinyl. No way that was gonna happen in one day. He set up mobile equipment in Detroit, as well as Davenport, Iowa, Cleveland, and Wildwood, New Jersey. Eddie was totally into the whole process, probably more committed to it than we were. It was actually kind of strange. We'd forget that he was there, or what sort of impact his presence might have on the show. I don't think any of us had a clue that a live record would prove to be the turning point in our careers. I sure as hell didn't. Before each of those shows I'd be hanging out in the dressing room, going through the usual routine, applying makeup, warming up, throwing back a few beers when Eddie would walk in and give us a little pep talk, as well as specific instructions. Remember, we're recording tonight, boys. Maybe you could do me a favor and try to move around a little less. Not jump quite so high. I'd just laugh. Kiss was Kiss. Asking us to hold back on stage was like asking a dog not to bark. It was in our DNA. You had to feel a little bit for Eddie. He had his work cut out for him. The things that mattered most to him as a producer, precise playing, clear, pitch, perfect singing, were secondary to us. Not that we didn't want to hit the right notes. I took great pride in my solos and always felt a bit of frustration or sadness after a show if I fucked something up. But the reality of playing live in a theatrical rock band is that mistakes are not uncommon. A live concert is a different animal than a studio performance. When the audience is screaming and you're running all over the stage, sweating and exhausted, your heart racing, things go by in a moment that would be unforgivable in a studio setting. The audience rarely even recognizes the clunkers, they're too caught up in the show. If we were on stage and somebody made a mistake, we'd just plow through it. There was no other option. In the end, all that mattered was that the audience went home happy. With a Kiss concert, the mission was accomplished on a nightly basis. That's what we wanted to project with Alive. The sense of fun and excitement and energy that was such a big part of the Kiss experience. Eddie wanted that, too. He also wanted to make a record that sounded great. In order for that to happen, he explained, some minor adjustments would have to be made. What do you mean? I asked him. Well, it might be easier if you just listened. Eddie proceeded to play some of the tracks off the tapes he'd recorded from our concerts, and I have to admit they were problematic. Oh, sure, they were loud and spirited and generally well played, and the crowd was into it. But there were many mistakes. Not just by the band, either. A lot can go wrong when you're recording a concert, technically speaking. The mix can be off, recording equipment can fail, instruments can be out of tune. Getting it right on the first try, to a degree that would please people who've paid $10 for the album, mostly hard-core fans who already know how the songs are supposed to sound, is no small task. Don't worry, Eddie assured us. We'll fix everything in the studio. The studio? So that's what we did. We all went into Electric Lady, and for the better part of 3 weeks we tinkered and tweaked, and sometimes completely overdubbed songs. None of us got off the hook completely. There were times when Eddie was unhappy with Paul's singing or Gene's singing. While he was generally pleased with my solos, I didn't nail every note as well as I might have. Sometimes Peter's tempo was off just a bit on the drums. As the studio sessions went on, we became increasingly flexible in terms of what we considered to be acceptable doctoring. We all agreed that Eddie had a strong ear and a great production sense. We trusted that he could bring Alive to life in a way that would please our fans without compromising our integrity. Eddie wanted a record that seemed like a live album, that reminded people of how it felt to be at a Kiss concert, without having to indulge the imperfections of a live performance. Does that mean it was a fake? I don't think so. The end justifies the means in this case. And anyway, Eddie didn't do anything that producers of live records hadn't been doing for years, in one form or another. He just did it better. I remember the first time I walked into the studio and saw these long loops set up, running between mic stands and tape machines, to add canned applause in the mixing process. This is done all the time with live records, although most people don't realize it. You add applause at the end of a song or the beginning of a new track, not simply to heighten excitement or to give the record a more concert-like feel, but also for the sake of continuity. It sweetens the sound. Same thing with the vocals. We re-recorded a bunch of tracks not with the idea of replacing whole songs, but rather so that Eddie could grab bits and pieces and make it seem like we nailed the harmonies in concert. This all seems pretty harmless today, in the age of prefab, cookie cutter pop stars with shitty voices made listenable only through the magic of auto-tune. To be perfectly candid, I didn't even think much of it back then. We were just trying to make the record a better product. And let's be clear about something, it wasn't just Eddie's idea, it was a collaborative effort. Kiss was never known as one of the greatest live musical bands. We were a show. In fact, that's what started to bother me after a while, the inescapable notion that with Kiss, the music was secondary. Even by this point, the majority of reviews focused less on our songs than on the special effects and makeup. That's just the way it was, and we all accepted it, me less than the others, as it turned out. But Eddie was absolutely right. There was no escaping the fact that the original concert recordings needed enhancement. I suppose if we had been a major platinum-selling band prior to the recording of Alive, we might have been slightly more cautious about screwing around with the actual live tracks. At this point, however, we were all starving for a breakthrough. I looked at the live album as a roll of the dice. What was the worst that could happen? People would ignore it? Or our fans would buy it and we'd have another modestly successful record? The one thing I couldn't envision was that Alive would become one of the biggest selling live albums in history, or that it would utterly change my life. But that's exactly what happened. Alive was released on September 10, 1975. Our fourth album in 18 months. Christ, that's amazing. I remember feeling overworked and tired, but when I look back on it now, the pace seems almost suicidal. 4 albums, including a double live album in a year and a half. That's a ridiculous amount of Kiss music out in the public realm in a very short span of time. No one would do that today. No one would even consider it. Even the most devoted fans of the best bands would overdose. Not Kiss fans. They devoured Alive in numbers we couldn't have imagined. It went gold, then it went platinum, 1 million copies sold, double platinum. Rock and Roll All Night, with a new guitar solo, became our first top 20 single. The album hit the Billboard charts quickly and stayed there for 2 years. 2 fucking years. Last time I checked, Alive had sold more than 4 million copies worldwide. It continues to sell well even today. The album's impact was apparent not just to us, but to the whole record industry. A year later, Peter Frampton became a superstar with the double live record. Frampton Comes Alive. And with the release of the live album at Budokan, Cheap Trick became one of the biggest selling bands in the world. I'd like to think we had something to do with their success. No one questioned whether the album was really live or whether we sounded that good in person. People simply ate it up. Nearly a decade would pass, and I'd be on a prolonged hiatus from the band, before Eddie started talking about the making of Alive. And the amount of studio work that went into it. Some fans were angry, many didn't care. If someone asks me today whether Alive truly is a live album, I'll usually answer with a question and a shrug, does it really matter? It's a terrific album, true to the Kiss spirit in every way. Nothing gives me greater pride than to hear some young guitarist say he learned how to play by listening to Alive. Or a veteran guitarist, like my buddies Mike McCready of Pearl Jam and Slash of Velvet Revolver and Guns N' Roses, tell me how inspired he was by the solos on Alive. In many ways that's more rewarding than all the gold records in the world. Alive is an iconic album, one that reflects as clearly as possible what it was like to be at a Kiss concert in 1975. Isn't that what counts?